In recent weeks, I have been most deeply touched by your wonderfully kind and thoughtful good wishes for my health, and in return, can only continue to serve you to the best of my ability throughout the Commonwealth. I shall strive to follow the inspiring example I have been set in upholding constitutional government and to seek the peace. The Crown has for so long been a symbol of unity for Canada.
In this video, we're going to uncover the shocking truth about King Charles's health crisis that Princess Catherine courageously revealed to the world, breaking decades of royal silence. You'll discover what really happened behind palace walls, the fierce battle between queens, and how one woman's bravery changed the monarchy forever. But before we dive in, I need you to do something, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear will shake everything you thought you knew about the royal family. And here's a question for you. If you were in Catherine's position, would you have spoken the truth or stayed silent? Drop your answer in the comments below. It all began on a freezing morning, November 22nd, when Princess Catherine stood before cameras and spoke words that would echo across the entire world. The king is seriously ill and fighting for his life. Those 9 simple words changed everything. Britain stopped in its tracks. Snow was falling heavily outside Windsor Castle, making everything look blurry and dreamlike. But inside those ancient walls, something real and frightening was happening. For weeks before this moment, people had been whispering and wondering, where was King Charles? Why hadn't anyone seen him? The palace kept saying he was just tired, that he needed rest. But Catherine knew the real story, and she could no longer keep it hidden. When she finally confirmed that Charles was battling cancer, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. News spread like wildfire from London to New York to every corner of the globe. People cried, prayed, and demanded to know more. Outside Buckingham Palace, citizens began lighting candles, their tiny flames dancing in the cold wind like prayers made visible. But not everyone saw Catherine as a hero. Inside Clarence's house, Queen Camilla was absolutely furious. She screamed that Catherine had broken the most important royal rule: never speak about private family matters. Camilla believed the royal family survived by keeping secrets, and Catherine had just destroyed that protection. Even Prince Harry and Meghan in America were caught completely off guard. They had no idea this announcement was coming. Meanwhile, back at Windsor, Catherine closed her door and sat alone with her thoughts. She knew she had done the right thing by telling the truth, but she also understood that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Up in Scotland at Balmoral Castle, Princess Anne read Catherine's statement and actually smiled. Finally, she thought, someone had the courage to speak when everyone else was scared. As snow continued to blanket London and church bells rang softly through the frozen air, one thing became crystal clear to everyone in Britain: Catherine had shattered the silence. And in doing so, she had exposed the monarchy's most carefully guarded secret. So what was really happening behind those massive palace doors before Catherine spoke? Let me take you inside those tense, terrifying hours. Think about what it's like when your family has a big secret that everyone knows, but nobody wants to say out loud. That's exactly what was happening in Buckingham Palace, except multiplied 1,000 times. Every hallway echoed with worried whispers. Staff members who worked there had been ordered not to talk about the king's health, but rumors had already escaped beyond the palace gates. One worker quietly said to another, "Something isn't right. He hasn't been seen in 3 whole weeks." Behind those thick stone walls, King Charles was getting worse. What started as regular treatment for an illness nobody would name had turned into something much more serious. His doctors, a small group of people he trusted completely, would sneak into Balmoral Castle pretending they were just visiting. Only 3 people knew how bad things really were: Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, and Catherine. Princess Anne had discovered the truth first when she went to visit her brother. She found him looking pale and weak, so tired he could barely lift his teacup. "You need to rest," and begged him. "You're working yourself to death." But Charles brushed off her concern. "The country expects me to do my job," he said quietly. "The moment I stop working, people will start preparing for the next king." That next king would be William, and the thought of it terrified Charles. Catherine, who always tried to balance feelings with responsibility, watched everything getting worse and worse. Charles refused to rest. Camilla refused to be honest with the public. Every time Catherine tried to arrange for the palace to update people about the king's health, Camilla's team would block her. The queen kept insisting that royal health is private and nobody's business. But Catherine could see right through this excuse. Camilla didn't want privacy, she wanted control. As Catherine spent more time at Windsor with her children, she started receiving secret messages from palace workers who admired her courage and trusted her judgment. One note that someone slipped into her briefcase said simply, "If the truth doesn't come from you, it never will." That night, Catherine sat by the fireplace staring into the dancing flames. William had fallen asleep in the chair next to her, exhausted from all the stress. She looked at her phone. Still no official statement from the palace after nearly 3 weeks of lies and excuses. Then another message arrived, this time from Princess Anne. It was short and direct: "He's getting worse, and Camilla is forcing the doctors to stay quiet." That was the moment Catherine made her decision. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and told her assistant to prepare a statement for the morning. "I'm going to tell them the truth," she said firmly. Nobody in the royal family had defied the palace's rules about talking to the media. Since Princess Diana's famous interviews decades ago, Catherine knew what this could cost her. She might lose the Queen's favor, her family's trust, maybe even the public's support. But she also knew what staying silent would cost the entire nation. By the time the sun started to rise, the air outside Windsor had turned bitter cold. Frost covered the courtyard like diamond dust. As the first rays of morning light touched the castle walls, Catherine's team uploaded her video just 30 seconds long. Within minutes, the secret the palace had been hiding was spreading faster than snow falling on the River Thames. For the first time in decades, the British monarchy wasn't speaking through its official spokespeople. It was speaking through a woman who absolutely refused to be silent. Now, here's something I want you to think about. Have you ever had to choose between following the rules and doing what you knew was right? Drop a comment and tell me about it. The moment Catherine's words reached the world, everything exploded. Within minutes, the royal machinery kicked into overdrive. At Clarence House, Queen Camilla called an emergency meeting with her communications team. Doors slammed, voices were raised, and one phrase kept being repeated: we need to contain the damage. But as Camilla would soon discover, the damage was already way beyond anyone's control. Across the entire United Kingdom, every news channel ran the exact same headline: Princess Catherine breaks palace silence, confirms King's cancer battle. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace holding candles and handwritten notes of support. For many British citizens, Catherine had transformed from the future queen into something even more important: their moral compass. Inside the palace, total chaos erupted. The Queen's private secretary stormed into her office warning that Catherine's statement had violated every single rule of royal protocol. Camilla's anger was ice cold and precise. "She's smarter than she looks," the Queen said. "She's done this deliberately to make me look like the villain." Behind those words was real fear. For months, Camilla had quietly taken control of palace communications as Charles got sicker. She had been controlling which details the press received and which stayed hidden. It was like a dangerous balancing act between protecting the king and manipulating the truth. Till Catherine's honesty tore through Camilla's web of control like scissors through silk. William, Catherine's husband, was being torn apart inside. Though he understood why his wife had spoken out, he also knew there would be terrible consequences. "You've drawn all the fire toward us," he said quietly that night. Catherine looked up at him, her face tired but determined. "The fire was already burning," she replied. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't there." By the next morning, the entire nation had chosen sides. British newspapers praised Catherine as the voice of truth. Meanwhile, Camilla's supporters in the media called Catherine reckless and emotional. Even international headlines turned the story into a moral drama, calling it a new Diana moment reborn in the age of social media. Princess Anne, the family's steady voice of reason, quickly stepped in. She drove to Windsor herself, slipping past photographers to meet Catherine privately. The two women sat in a small room overlooking the frozen gardens and spoke bluntly. "You did what none of us had the courage to do," she said. "That takes real bravery. But now you must be careful because Camilla will never forgive you." Catherine nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "I didn't do it for her forgiveness," she said. "I did it for him, for the king," and smiled slightly. "That's exactly why he trusts you more than any of us." At Balmoral, Charles's doctors struggled to keep his condition private as reporters swarmed the grounds. The king himself, confined to his bed and protected from most updates, eventually learned about Catherine's statement through Anne when she read it aloud to him. His eyes grew soft. "She told the truth?" he asked weakly. "Yes," Anne replied. "And now the whole world knows." A long silence filled the room before Charles said quietly, "Then let them know. Truth is all I have left anymore." But even that moment of peace couldn't slow the approaching storm. Within hours, Camilla's office released a statement claiming that Catherine's words had been misunderstood, and that the king's condition wasn't as serious as suggested. These contradictory messages sent shockwaves through the press, and soon public trust in the palace began to crack and crumble. Protests of support erupted outside Windsor. People brought flowers, handwritten letters, and even portraits of Charles with the words "he deserves honesty" written beneath. Reporters began comparing Camilla's secrecy to the media manipulation scandals from decades past. The ghost of the Diana years had returned, haunting the monarchy like a cold wind blowing through its golden halls. Inside the royal household, Camilla's power began to slip away. Senior advisors grew nervous. "The public supports transparency," one aide whispered. "If we fight Catherine, we lose the people." But Camilla wasn't the type to back down. Late one night, she called her press chief and gave a chilling order: if she wants to play the hero, remind the world she's just another ordinary person who married into privilege. It was the beginning of a quiet campaign designed to damage Catherine's image, without ever mentioning her name directly. Meanwhile, Catherine found herself at the center of a storm she never wanted. The country adored her, but she felt uneasy about suddenly being called the hero. "I'm not the hero they think I am," she confessed to enduring a late-night phone call. "I just couldn't stay silent anymore." Anne's voice was steady on the other end. "And that," she said, "is exactly why they'll follow you." As the first snowflakes of evening began falling again over London, a quiet but undeniable truth settled over Britain. The battle for the monarchy's soul had begun, and for once, the war wasn't between kings, it was between two queens fighting for what they each believed was right. What do you think? Was Catherine brave for speaking out? Or should she have respected the royal tradition of silence? I really want to hear your thoughts on this. The sun never truly rose over London that next morning. The night just faded into a slightly lighter shade of gray. Thick fog hung low over the Thames River, and the lights of Buckingham Palace flickered faintly through the haze like distant stars. Britain was waking up to a monarchy on the edge of tearing itself apart. Inside Windsor Castle, Princess Catherine sat in her study surrounded by open newspapers spread across every surface. Her photograph was everywhere. Some headlines called her the people's princess of truth, others labeled her a danger to the crown. The same image of her calm, composed face seemed to split the nation right down the middle. For Catherine, the aftermath felt suffocating. She hadn't slept properly in days. William kept urging her to stay quiet and let the storm pass, but she knew better. Camilla won't let this go, she said softly. She'll try to rewrite the entire story before the truth can settle in people's minds. And Catherine was absolutely right. At Clarence House, Queen Camilla was already moving with surgical precision. Her private secretary invited top royal reporters for a secret briefing. The message was simple, but poisonous Catherine had misinterpreted the king's condition and created panic where none was needed. To the tabloids, this was pure gold, a new headline war between two of the most powerful women in Britain. Meanwhile, Princess, and ever the pragmatic soldier of the monarchy, decided she'd had enough of the fighting. She drove to Balmoral herself, marching past bewildered security staff and demanding to see her brother. Charles, frail but mentally alert, looked up from his bed and smiled faintly. "You look angry," he said. "I am angry," and replied, "You've let them turn your illness into a theater performance. The people deserve better," and Catherine was absolutely right to speak up. Charles sighed, his voice brittle as dried leaves. "She's brave, yes, but bravery cuts both ways. I can't lose my family while trying to save the institution." Anne's response was simple and direct, and stop pretending you can have both. That conversation, overheard by a palisade, would later be described as the exact moment the king realized how far things had spiraled out of control. That evening, Anne called Catherine directly. "You must go public again," she said, "not to defend yourself, but to protect him." Catherine hesitated. "They'll accuse me of undermining the queen." Anne's voice was firm and unwavering. "You're not undermining her, you're reminding her what real loyalty looks like." The decision was made right then, and their dot at dawn the next day. Catherine appeared on the steps of a children's hospital she had supported for years. Dressed simply in gray wool, she stopped briefly before the cameras and spoke quietly, her breath turning to mist in the cold air. "His Majesty remains under medical care and is receiving the best treatment possible. We're grateful for your kindness and for your patience." It was gentle and diplomatic, but every single word carried enormous power. She hadn't accused anyone. She hadn't deflected responsibility. She had reclaimed control through pure grace. The people responded immediately. Within hours, the phrase "Stand with Catherine" trended across social media platforms. Supporters gathered outside Windsor holding handwritten signs saying courage is contagious. Others lit candles by the gates, their reflections flickering against the iron bars like tiny beacons of hope. Camilla, watching the coverage from Clarence House, was seething with rage. She's turned sympathy into a weapon, she muttered to her staff. Her aides urged calm, but Camilla was already drafting her next move, a carefully worded statement signed Her Majesty the Queen, affirming that private family matters must remain private. It was a subtle rebuke, but everyone knew exactly who it was aimed at. William tried desperately to keep the peace, visiting his father at Balmoral and begging him to intervene. "We can't keep fighting in public like this," he pleaded. Charles looked out the window, his breath fogging against the glass. "You think I don't see it?" he asked. "My wife fighting my daughter-in-law, both believing they're protecting me." He turned back to his son. "This crown has always divided the ones who love me most." While the king struggled between loyalty and love, the British media devoured every single moment of the drama. Late-night television programs debated who was right, the pragmatic queen or the truthful princess. Opinion polls began to shift dramatically. Nearly 70% of people surveyed now said Catherine's honesty made them trust the monarchy more than they had in years. As public sentiment shifted, even some palace aides began quietly defecting to Catherine's side. A senior press officer confided to a journalist, "We follow strength, and she's the only one showing any right now." By the weekend, Camilla's influence had begun to shrink noticeably. For the first time in years, her team stopped dictating the palace's narrative. Instead, the public looked to Windsor, to Catherine, for reassurance and truth. That night, the king requested to make a brief televised message. The entire nation waited breathlessly as he appeared on their screens, pale but composed. Speaking from Balmoral's wood-paneled study, "There is truth in transparency and dignity and compassion," he said slowly and deliberately. "The crown endures because of people, not in spite of them." It was widely seen as a subtle nod to Catherine and a quiet criticism of Camilla. By the time the broadcast ended, the monarchy's power balance had completely shifted. Catherine had done the impossible. She had told the difficult truth and still kept her dignity intact. Outside Windsor Castle, the snow continued to fall, thick, white, and unending. And under that silent sky, the people knew they had witnessed something incredibly rare, not rebellion, but genuine renewal of faith in their royal family. If you had to choose between keeping peace in your family or speaking an uncomfortable truth, which would you choose? Tell me in the comments, because I think we've all faced this choice at some point. By the evening of November 22nd, the storm Catherine had started finally reached its breaking point. The palace, usually a symbol of calm and perfect control, had become a battlefield of words, strategy, and betrayal. Reporters described it as the longest night Buckingham Palace has seen since the death of the late Queen Elizabeth. Inside Clarence House, Queen Camilla was in full crisis mode. Her staff rushed frantically between offices, shredding rough drafts. editing statements over and calling trusted media allies for help. One aide whispered nervously, "We're losing the country's support." Camilla turned sharply toward them. "No," she said coldly. "We're losing control of the narrative, and I fully intend to take it back." Her plan was bold and absolutely ruthless. At 8 o'clock that evening, she authorized an exclusive interview with one of Britain's most loyal royal correspondents. Sitting in a perfectly staged parlor and dressed in elegant black velvet, Camilla faced the camera with practiced serenity. "The king is stable," she began softly. "But I must stress that recent statements from certain members of the family were premature and have caused unnecessary distress to His Majesty. Our duty is to protect his peace, not parade his pain before the world." It was like a dagger hidden inside a velvet glove. Without ever naming Catherine directly, Camilla had accused her of being emotionally reckless and turning the king's illness into a public spectacle. The queen had drawn her battle lines clearly, and the entire world knew exactly who she was fighting against. The backlash was absolutely instantaneous. Within minutes of the interview airing, social media completely exploded. One British journalist tweeted immediately the Queen's message was clear and deliberately cruel. Another wrote Catherine acted out of compassion, but Camilla acted out of cold calculation. Public opinion split, but not evenly at all. Overnight polls showed that nearly 2/3 of Britain sided firmly with Catherine, calling her the moral backbone that held the monarchy together. At Windsor, Catherine sat silently as her team showed her clips from the interview. Her face remained completely unreadable, but her eyes shimmered with carefully restrained anger. "She used the king's pain to publicly humiliate me," Catherine said quietly. William tried to calm her down, but Catherine's voice rose slightly, quiet but fierce as a storm. "She's forgotten who this is actually about. It's not her crown, and it's not mine. It's his life we're talking about." Far from the cameras up at Balmoral Castle, King Charles was too physically weak to intervene. But he wasn't unaware of what was happening. His doctor tried to turn off the television, but Charles waved him off weakly. "Let me see what they've made of us," he murmured. As Camilla's interview played on the screen, he whispered almost to himself, "I didn't fight my whole life for the truth to be weaponized like this." Princess Anne, who had been traveling back from Scotland, arrived at Balmoral just before midnight struck. She found her brother sitting upright in bed despite his weakness, clutching a document in his trembling hands. It was his written response, something he had drafted completely alone. "You can't release this," and said gently but firmly. "You'll only make things worse." Charles looked up at her, his voice thin but absolutely resolute. "If I say nothing, I lose her trust forever. If I speak, I lose peace temporarily. But silence has killed more relationships than words ever will." By the next morning, his statement was ready to be released. At 7 o'clock, the BBC confirmed that a royal broadcast would air at noon, one written and approved solely by King Charles himself without any palace interference. The speech lasted barely 3 minutes, but its impact was absolutely seismic and earth-shaking. Seated at his desk looking pale but composed, Charles addressed the entire nation with clear purpose. "There has been much said recently about illness, loyalty, and duty," he began. "Let me be absolutely clear about something. My family's greatest strength lies in its capacity for compassion." The Princess of Wales spoke from a place of love, not defiance, and I am deeply grateful to her for that courage. He paused deliberately, then continued with unmistakably firm tone. "The crown's future is safe in the hands of those who believe that honesty and kindness are not weaknesses to be hidden, they are our salvation and our strength." Across Britain, viewers actually wept while watching. For the first time in many months, the king's physical frailty seemed completely secondary to his profound humanity and wisdom. But inside Clarence's house, Camilla's face turned completely ashen and pale. One aide later recalled it was like watching a chess player suddenly realize they'd just been checkmated by a single, perfect move. By evening that same day, Catherine's name was trending globally across every continent. Crowds outside Windsor sang "God Save the King" while others chanted "We stand with her" in unified voices. A photograph of Catherine looking pensively out her window, taken later that night, became instantly iconic around the world. Her expression was soft, reflective, yet completely unbroken by the pressure. William joined her in the quiet darkness. "He chose you," William said finally. Catherine shook her head gently. "No," she replied with certainty. "He chose truth. I just had the courage to carry it for him when he couldn't." As night fell and the world watched the palace lights flicker against the falling snow, one historical era seemed to definitively end the era of quiet compromise and hidden truths. What had begun as a carefully guarded secret illness had completely transformed into a national reckoning about power, transparency, and trust in institutions. And in that profound reckoning, a princess had just outshone a queen not through manipulation, but through simple, honest courage. Here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Catherine's decision to speak publicly will strengthen or weaken the royal family in the long run? Drop your prediction in the comments. The morning after King Charles's powerful broadcast, the entire nation seemed to breathe again, though nobody could quite agree on what they were breathing in: relief, shock, or perhaps the startling realization that the monarchy, defined for so long by carefully guarded secrecy, had finally been stripped completely bare before its people. In London, the scene felt almost surreal and dreamlike. Outside Buckingham Palace, large crowds gathered beneath a heavy gray sky. Some clutched flowers tightly, while others waved flags with renewed pride. Someone began playing "God Save the King" on a violin, and complete strangers stopped walking to listen together. It wasn't exactly celebration happening there, it was recognition and acknowledgement. For the first time in many years, The royal family actually felt genuinely human again instead of distant and untouchable. Inside Balmoral Castle, King Charles slept soundly and peacefully for the first time in weeks. His doctors reported minor but meaningful improvement in his condition, though they carefully warned that full recovery would take a very long time. Yet despite his physical weakness, the king's mind was clearer and sharper than it had been in months. When Princess Anne entered his room that morning, he managed a faint smile. "I did what mother would have done," he whispered with satisfaction, and nodded in agreement. "You did what she would have wanted you to remind everyone. That honesty is an essential part of duty, not separate from it." But for Queen Camilla, the fallout was absolutely devastating and career-ending. Her press team went completely silent. Her private secretary resigned by noon without explanation. The morning newspapers were absolutely merciless in their coverage. The Guardian called Charles's speech a rebuke wrapped carefully in compassion. The Times ran a headline that read, "Charles backs Catherine, palace divided no more." Her closest allies in the press suddenly refused to return her desperate phone calls. By midday, Camilla retreated completely from public view, canceling all upcoming engagements without explanation. Rumors spread wildly that she had left London altogether, retreating to her private country home at Mill to escape the judgment. One royal aide described her emotional state with just one simple sentence. She believed she had lost both the narrative and the king's support simultaneously. At Windsor Castle, Catherine quietly returned to her royal duties with understated grace and dignity. There were no triumphant interviews, no stage photo opportunities, only genuine presence and service. She visited hospitals and food banks, shaking hands warmly and listening carefully the exact way Queen Elizabeth once did. Reporters noticed her remarkable calmness, the way she smiled genuinely through obvious exhaustion. One newspaper columnist wrote movingly, "She looks like a woman who somehow carried an entire nation's grief on her shoulders and still managed to stay standing upright." William had also changed noticeably during this crisis. In private conversations, he became more deliberate and thoughtful, less automatically diplomatic than before. He felt genuinely proud of his wife's courage, but remained wary of the deep fractures left behind in family relationships. "You've won the public's heart completely," he told her one quiet night as they sat together by the fireplace. "But at what ultimate cost to us?" Catherine turned slowly toward him. "There's no such thing as winning when it comes to truth," she said quietly but firmly. "There's only doing what's morally right regardless of consequences." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, Prince Harry and Meghan made their very first public statement since the crisis began unfolding. It was brief, extremely cautious, and almost surprisingly tender in tone. "We send love and strength to the king and the entire family during this difficult time," they wrote carefully. But insider sources claimed privately that the couple had been genuinely stunned by the dramatic events unfolding, slowly realizing that Catherine had managed through one single act of defiance to achieve something they themselves never could speak truth directly to power and still be embraced warmly for doing it. In the British Parliament, political leaders from both major parties publicly praised the king's remarkable courage. One member of Parliament stood up during session and declared in an age drowning in deception and spin, "His Majesty has given us something absolutely priceless and rare genuine transparency." That single powerful line was quoted in every major newspaper the very next day. But perhaps the single most striking and memorable image of the entire aftermath came that Sunday morning. King Charles appeared briefly at St. George's Chapel, supported carefully on one side by Anne and on the other by William. Catherine followed a few respectful steps behind, dressed in understated muted navy, her expression serene and peaceful. As the choir sang softly and beautifully, the entire congregation stood together, not merely for ceremony and tradition, but for genuine solidarity and support. Later, as the family left the chapel slowly, Catherine paused momentarily to look back at the ultra-simple gesture, but one that every camera captured perfectly. When asked later by reporters what she had been thinking in that quiet moment, she reportedly said something profound: that truth doesn't actually destroy kingdoms and nations. It rebuilds them stronger than before. In the days and weeks that followed, donations to royal charities absolutely soared to record levels. Letters flooded in from every corner of the world expressing support and admiration. Public confidence in the monarchy rose dramatically to its highest levels since Queen Elizabeth's passing. Meanwhile, Camilla remained completely silent and absent. But this time, her silence no longer represented control and power. It meant retreat and defeat. And as snow once again began falling softly over Windsor Castle, it seemed almost perfectly symbolic, like a clean slate, a gentle cover placed over the deep wounds that had nearly torn the royal family completely apart. The crown had somehow survived this crisis, but it was absolutely no longer the same crown it had been before. It was lighter now, more humble, and for the first time in a very long time, genuinely human and accessible to ordinary people. Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever stood up for what was right, even when it cost you something important? Share your story below, because I believe we all have more in common with Catherine than we might think. The heavy snow that had covered London for days finally began melting away, revealing streets glistening beautifully beneath the pale, forgiving sun. The chaos and shouting had completely passed. The anger had quieted down, and in its place, a strange but welcome kind of peace slowly settled over all of Britain. What had started as a terrifying moment, the king's serious illness, the palace's stubborn silence, and the courage of one woman's honest voice, had somehow become something much greater and more meaningful. It had become a profound lesson in truth, compassion, and the real cost of doing what is morally right when absolutely everyone else chooses to stay quiet and compliant. King Charles was still recovering slowly at Balmoral, his days passing gently and tenderly. He spent most quiet mornings sitting by the window watching the beautiful Highland mist drift softly through the ancient pine trees. His doctors reported that his progress was steady and encouraging, but it was actually his spirit and attitude, not his physical strength, that surprised everyone around him most. People who visited him said he smiled more genuinely now, as if an enormous burden he had carried silently for his entire lifetime had finally, mercifully lightened. For the first time in his long royal life, he reportedly told Princess Anne, "With relief I can finally breathe as myself, not merely as a symbol people expect me to be." And, as always completely practical and direct, replied simply, "You've earned that peace, brother. And you're extremely lucky because not every monarch gets to leave behind peace and truth, instead of secrets and lies." At Windsor Castle, Catherine continued fulfilling her royal engagements with quiet dedication. No triumph, no fanfare, absolutely no victory lap, only steady, genuine duty and service. She had become something far more significant than just a princess through this ordeal. She had become a living moral compass, a powerful reminder that grace and complete honesty could actually coexist beautifully in a world absolutely addicted to performance and pretense. When asked by a persistent journalist if she regretted speaking out publicly, she smiled softly and said with wisdom, "Sometimes silence can protect you temporarily, but it can also imprison you permanently. I deliberately chose the much harder road, but at least now I can walk it every day with a completely clear heart and conscience." That single profound line captured absolutely everything about her character and choice. Because beyond all the drama, beyond the politics and power struggles, this was never truly just a story about royalty and palaces. It was fundamentally about humanity itself, about what happens when one ordinary person decides that truth matters infinitely more than tradition, and that integrity matters infinitely more than image and appearance. And in making that choice, Catherine had accomplished something genuinely extraordinary. She had somehow transformed tragedy into a mirror for everyone watching worldwide. Not just for Britain, but for absolutely anyone who has ever been told to keep quiet, to obey without question, to protect a broken system at the terrible cost of their own conscience and values. In the end, her defiance didn't weaken or damage the monarchy at all. It actually purified and strengthened it. It reminded the entire world that even institutions as ancient and rigid as the crown can genuinely change and evolve, not through official decrees or elaborate ceremonies, but through simple empathy, humility, and the remarkable courage of a single honest voice. From my personal perspective, watching this entire story unfold feels less like witnessing typical royal gossip and drama, and much more like seeing the actual anatomy of truth itself being revealed. It's remarkably easy to forget that behind all the gold, the magnificent palaces, and the impressive titles, there are still just people, real people who hurt deeply, who hope desperately, who make mistakes, and who carry the enormous weight of their choices every single day. What Catherine did wasn't rebellion or betrayal. It was genuine leadership, the kind that doesn't automatically wear a crown, but definitely earns one through character. Maybe that's the powerful message the entire world desperately needed to hear. That real leadership isn't actually about control or prestige at all, it's about compassion. About speaking clearly when silence itself becomes a form of cruelty. Even Queen Camilla's downfall offers a strange kind of wisdom if we look carefully. Her obsession with image, her deep fear of losing relevance and control, it reflects something deeply human too. The instinct to hold on desperately even when letting go might actually bring peace. That's universal. History won't remember her nearly as kindly as Catherine, but perhaps her role was somehow necessary anyway. She was the shadow that made Catherine's light shine even brighter by contrast. And as for King Charles, frail, flawed, but absolutely sincere, his acceptance of truth may ultimately be his most lasting act as monarch. Not his coronation ceremony, not his reforms and policies, but this allowing his son's wife to speak the difficult words he physically couldn't, and by doing so, restoring genuine faith in the institution his beloved mother had built and protected. When historians write this chapter decades from now, it won't be titled The King's Illness or The Palace Scandal. It will simply read The Winter of Truth, because in the end, this story wasn't really about sickness or power at all. It was about honesty, and about how even in a kingdom built carefully on centuries of silence, one single honest voice can change absolutely everything forever. And maybe, as we watch the snow melt around Windsor and hear the bells ring softly over Balmoral, we are all reminded of something beautifully simple. That truth, no matter how painful it feels initially, always leaves behind light. And in that light flickering, fragile, but absolutely real, the monarchy, and perhaps all of us watching, find a way to begin again. So, here's my final question for you. And I really want you to answer this honestly in the comments. What's one truth you've been afraid to speak in your own life, and what's holding you back? Because Catherine's story teaches us that sometimes the hardest thing to say is exactly what needs to be heard. Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe, because we're going to keep bringing you the real stories behind the headlines that everyone else is afraid to tell. The truth matters, and your voice matters too.